Hello, my name's Melz.
Hi, and my name is Campbell.
So, Campbell, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I am a filmmaker. I made the feature film Stud Life, and which is a kind of urban rom-com, which is set in London and it's LGBTQI. I also made the film Desire, which is around desire for trans, masculine, non-binary, AFAB, female masculinity, and a short film Visible about the challenges of, you know, reclaiming like QTPOC history in the UK. I also directed the web series Different for Girls and co-directed the other web series Spectrum London, which was a trans-centered web series. And so
Amazing.
tell me a bit about yourself, Melz. Thank you. Thank you.
So, I am a creative, a consultant, and an academic. So, I am studying a PhD. Well, I'm about to start studying my PhD at Cambridge University, looking at the relationship between social justice and justice in the sense of how we produce knowledge. I'm also a consultant. I do a lot of like social justice consultancy work with universities, different organizations. I do a lot of public speaking as well about decolonisation, about black feminism, about queer identities, about trans identities in various spaces, universities, community spaces, and so on. And I make music sometimes. I write poetry, I write prose, and just a general artist, I guess. So yeah, that's about me. So Campbell, I would love to know what your experience of transitioning now has been.
I think me transitioning now has been a process. And, I've always identified as masculine ever since a child. And, that's never been a thing or not a thing. I think more coming to the trans identity now, it's because of your generation, actually, the Zoomers and the Millennials who brought in a much more fluid and diverse way of looking at trans identity. And that allowed me to access my own trans identity, which I would say is not centered in default cis heterosexual masculinity as the norm in my trans identity. I'm queer and I center my queerness and kind of non heteronormativity. So, having access to that in trans masculinity was very liberating for me, and it could only really happen now in terms of having access to healthcare, which is not is no longer based on that model of kind of a binary idea of transitioning, and that fits more comfortably with me and allows me to be my authentic self. So, for me personally, that's my journey into transitioning. Um, but what would you
Amazing.
say yours was in a way?
Oh, that's
Because
amazing.
you're a
I
different
can,
generation.
yeah, of course, but I can definitely resonate with a lot of what you said, Campbell. Um, so I identify as non-binary, and this idea of allowing gender to be more fluid, having more access to not just because part of my transition, part of my gender identity is a political position against the construct of gender in a lot of ways, and seeing the harm that I feel gender does in the world, the fact that it's a colonial construct, and being able to allow that to flow through my being as a person and not being beholden too much to one form of gender, but still acknowledging like the fact that I need to feel comfortable in my body, the fact that I can traverse the categories of male and female and be who I am to the fullest is such an exciting thing for me. And so growing up, I wasn't aware of many trans people in general, even though now I'm 25 and I have been on this process for about 2 to 3 years. And then when I did find any trans people, they were all white, and I was like, this must be this white thing that's going on. Like, I can't have access to that. I don't see anyone like myself. But I guess the advent of social media, and in my personal life as well, meeting other trans Black people has given me the space to see myself in many different ways, and allowed me to think that, okay, I can actually be the gender that I am and live out my life on my own terms.
Yeah, and I think the idea, for me, also the idea of trans is a cross. So it's a cross gender. It's not sort of fixated on one or the other because, you know, I've been socialized in certain ways as a Black Caribbean person and of African descent. And, you know, more recently have come to understand historically and pre colonial indigenous people, African descent people had a kind of spiritual base which was more gender fluid. Lots of gods and goddesses were gender fluid and queer in our culture historically. So the idea that, you know, trans is something new is a purely Western concept because trans has been with us for millennia. And we're now talking about it more on social media. And it didn't mean the conversations didn't happen before, they just weren't amplified on the internet. So, you know, the idea of being transgender and was also referred to as being transsexual was something that happened even in Western society quite a long time ago. And in my lifetime, lots of my friends transitioned and were part of, you know, queer world, but there seemed to be kind of pressure to disappear into heteronormativity, which didn't really sit right with me. So I'm grateful to your generation for bringing that more to the foreground,
Absolutely.
to allow us to have access to that in a structural form, not just as a conversation amongst ourselves, but to be able to access that, you know, in healthcare as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what are your thoughts on ageism and racism within the current trans narratives?
Yeah, that's a, you know, a good question because the way that I look, and I must confess I access a lot of trans activism through social media, and from what I see, it tends to be very young, um, very white, very almost quite cisnormative and binary. And those are the voices that seem to get plucked out to represent us. And I find that incredibly problematic because then it creates its own trans narrative as if there is only one acceptable face of trans activism. There is only one voice of trans activism, and that voice has to be acceptable by the cis-centric mainstream media. And and then it's fed back to us, other trans people, as this is the desirable way to be trans and this is the desirable trans narrative. And I find that that's a bad thing, actually. That's a bad thing, particularly for something that's quite new in a way in terms of the voices being so amplified. And, you know, I have to remember the thing that Angela Davis, black communist feminist, said when she came to the South Bank. She said, our feminism has to center trans women of color who have been incarcerated, who are working class and poor. And once we do that, our feminism will be much better. The minute we don't center those women in our politics and our feminism, it means that our trans activism and our feminism is flawed. And I completely agree with her on that point. I mean, this is the way that I see it from my point of view, but I'm not sure how you see it from your point of view, Melz, because you might
Yeah,
look at it a bit different.
no, absolutely. I definitely resonate with everything you said. And my thoughts are just in the kind of similar frame to what we were discussing earlier, and seeing the ways that this concept called like homo nationalism or queer nationalism, the idea that the West is now leading the fight for like queer rights and trans rights, is a product of colonialism, and it's a form of, it's one of the ways that they continue to colonize us, through making us think that the Western white world is the liberal, tolerant place, whereas our homes are behind in time. When actually, when I've done a lot of personal research and just personal ancestral and spiritual connection, seeing the ways that gender just did not feed into the formations of our societies prior to colonization in the same way that it's done in the West, and seeing that we have a pantheon of ancestors that are gender non-conforming, that are trans, that are, there's so many words to describe what these people are, and to recognize that through like spiritual connection as well, that these ancestors are walking with all of us all day, all the time. Like, we're standing upon their shoulders. Like, we're not standing upon the shoulders of this white concept of what transness is. Like, we're standing upon the shoulders of completely breaking free from gender, completely obliterating the concept and allowing ourselves to be free, allowing ourselves to feel full. That's what I think about racism and ageism. It shouldn't be a conversation, but because the history is cut off in such a harmful way, it becomes this kind of false dichotomy that has been produced. Like, being trans is young and white, whereas being cis is what people of color and older people are and do, which is just infactual.
Yeah,
So
and also in a way it's ahistorical, because
yeah,
it forgets that under colonialism, and particularly my ancestry under slavery, black people didn't have a gender, we were property. There wasn't
yeah,
women and men, it was
that's also
property.
true.
And it was only called into action when they wanted us to reproduce for the plantation system, to reproduce for capitalism, to create more of a labor force. So, this
Absolutely.
idea that gender is universal, one in a historic context, or even in terms of genetics, we don't know our genotypes with respect to gender unless we've done that analysis ourselves. You know what I mean? We only look at what people look like. But our ancestors didn't just look at what people looked like, they looked at our energy to see what spiritual energy are we bringing to the table. And very often people who are gender non-conforming or gender fluid were considered sacred. So, I think let's go back to that concept of thinking of us as gods and goddesses and how we can bring that spiritual energy to the conversation, because it's not happening.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So the final question that we have is, what advice would you give to either me or just generally black trans people out there, whatever age?
Well, I would say be like you, Melz, because I follow you a lot, and you're no, seriously, your writing has been very inspiring to me, but also your travels and the way that you link to ancestry and you center blackness, and I think that's one thing for black trans people to do, is to think of how we can center blackness,
Absolutely.
also how we can do self-care. Audre Lorde talks about self-care, and it's not, self-care isn't really about having a bubble bath, although that could be part of it, but it's about yeah, you don't have to buy self-care, but it's about seeing how we can be at home in our bodies, because there's so much pressure outside to conform to cis normativity, whether we have an operation or not. How we can truly center our transness, feel whole in it, and meditate on that every day, instead of comparing ourselves and our processes to other trans people as a kind of competition, but also as a competition in how we can approximate cis normativity, because not all cisgendered bodies are the same.
Mm-hmm.
And not all people who are cisgender are comfortable in their own bodies. So
Mm-hmm.
the lesson for us as trans people will be the same for all humans. How can we accept that we are all different and not use a model as this is the right way to be and this is the abnormal way to be? If we can approach something where we are all normal and accept diversity of humanity, it will be such a beautiful thing.
Ashe, ashe, ashe. Absolutely, Campbell. I love that. I love every single part of that. And
What
yeah,
would
in
you
terms
say
of
though? Like, because, yeah, because, as I always say, I'm coming to it from possibly a different viewpoint, being older than you and kind of wanting, I learned from you as well, but, what would you say for yourself?
yeah, I would definitely echo everything that you said, and probably just add that you can be whoever you want to be, and just like so simply, like this world, like these constructs that we live under, these labels, these ideas, these everything is up for questioning. Everything is up for discussion. Nothing is true and in and of itself. Like to all that we should all what we should all be able to do is just allow ourselves to feel within ourselves, to connect to ourselves and vibrate out whatever energy, as you were saying, and whatever gender, that whatever form that takes on. And to just really also encourage the kind of breaking of the limits that I feel are currently upon the trans conversation. And it often feels like, because we're often in a place of getting vitriol thrown at us, that a lot of the discourse comes from a place of defense, which is
Yeah,
very
yeah,
understanding.
yeah.
What I'd love to see is in our closed spaces, in other spaces, for us to speak about gender in the most expansive, the most imaginative ways, and to come out of like this very binary, this means this and therefore we need to be respected in this way, like, which should just be. But to be able to allow ourselves to feel freer in those discourses, and to feel like, okay, if I may be like if I identified as, say, a trans man, and that I may feel like I may want to switch that up sometimes. I may want to like feel a bit lucid with that. Do you know what I mean? And allowing all of ourselves to feel as free, as embodied, and as capable within our identities and within our beings.
Yeah, and I think that will open it up to all of us being able to be, more fluid, more, at ease with ourselves as who we want to be, not just as trans people, but as cis people. And I think why trans people are so disturbing to a lot of people is because we are choosing to be authentic. We're
Mm-hmm.
choosing to center ourselves and
Absolutely.
against rules that have been laid down, which don't suit anybody, really, quite
They
frankly. They
do.
suit no one.
Mm-hmm.
And we're disrupting that. And by disrupting that, that's going to make people feel uncomfortable, But
Absolutely.
if they just allow themselves to disrupt too, then we're onto something very exciting, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I like to say that both my blackness and my transness are movement. Like, we should be able to move and explore and grow within our identities every single day and transform. Do you know what I mean? So yeah,
Transform. Ashe.
absolutely. Ashe. Well, it was wonderful chatting to you, Campbell. A
Same
blessing
here,
as
Melz.
always. So insightful. And Campbell, the work that you've done, the ways that you have shown, the path that you've paved, like, I never want to like, I can't even find the words, but I just really want to amplify that and just thank you for that as well. And just, you've been a voice, a shining light within the queer community, and the work that you're doing for AFAB people as well that are identified along the masculine spectrum is so important, and that just really needs to be recognized. So thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you. And thank you for carrying the torch, because we need your voice, Melz. We really need your voice. It's very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.